Nebraska Sandhills, late October 1886. Nobody noticed what was happening beneath that lonely prairie cabin. From the dirt wagon road cutting through the endless windswept sandhills, it looked like any other frontier homestead. Rough-cut timber walls, a sod roof patched with dry prairie grass, and a single stone chimney leaking thin blue wood smoke into the crisp autumn breeze. But if you had stopped your wagon, stepped down into the dust, and listened closely to the earth itself, you might have heard something deeply strange. A low, muffled shuffle of heavy hooves coming from directly below the cabin floorboards. By the time the scattered settlers in the territory realized what Emmett Graves had built, it was already far too late to laugh. Because when the catastrophic blizzard of January 1887 buried the American plains under 6 feet of snow and killed thousands of livestock across 3 counties, his horses walked out into the morning sun completely unharmed, while his neighbors spent weeks digging their frozen stock out of solid ice. What did this quiet Michigan logging veteran understand about thermal mass, convective cooling, and earth-sheltered architecture that professional builders completely missed? And why did a structural design widely mocked as foolish madness become the ultimate blueprint for frontier survival across the sandhills? Stay with me here, because what happened next proves that true frontier engineering often looks like absolute insanity right up until the moment winter speaks. If you want to see one forgotten historical survival strategy every single week that actually worked when human lives hung in the balance, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what is the coldest winter you have ever personally survived. Emmett Graves was not trying to make a statement. He was not an architect, an inventor, or a man given to grand speeches. He was 32 years old, built low to the ground, with calloused hands, sun-cured skin, and a heavy limp in his left leg from a timber logging accident back in the thick woods of northern Michigan. In the spring of 1884, Emmett had filed a claim on 160 acres under the Homestead Act, located roughly 2 miles south of a tiny prairie settlement that did not even have an official name on the territorial maps yet. It was nothing more than a crude post office, a general store stocked with salt pork and flour, and a dozen homesteading families scattered across grassland that rolled away to the horizon like a frozen green ocean. Emmett owned 4 horses. He had 2 heavy draft animals, a bay gelding named Rust and a dark gray mare named Cinder, along with 2 lighter saddle horses he used for checking fence lines and making the long supply run into town. On that brutal stretch of the Nebraska frontier, horses were not a luxury or a hobby. They were pure survival. They were your plow engine, your winter transportation, your rescue line, and, in a devastating season, the absolute difference between eating grain or watching your family starve. Now, picture this. Emmett had learned a bitter, unforgiving lesson during his first 2 winters trying to scratch a living out of the Nebraska prairie. Conventional wooden barns did not protect animals from extreme winter cold. They only protected them from falling rain. The relentless Great Plains wind cut right through standard pine plank walls, like they were made of damp paper. On clear January nights, temperatures on the open flatlands would plunge far below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and inside a standard wooden barn, the air was barely 2 or 3 degrees warmer than the gale howling outside. Horses stood shivering in their wooden stalls hour after hour, burning through their precious body fat just trying to maintain core body temperature. When a killer cold front descended and stayed locked over the plains for 5 or 6 straight days, weaker animals simply stopped eating, stopped moving, and froze solid right where they stood. In January of 1886, during his second year on the claim, Emmett lost a prime yearling colt. He walked out after a 3-day freeze to find the young animal standing stiff in the corner of his timber barn, eyes glazed over, and thick white frost coating its eyelashes. That wooden barn had cost Emmett 3 hard weeks of physical labor and $60 in precious milled lumber that he had hauled across 40 miles of rough trail. The structure had failed completely. It was nothing more than a wooden box filled with trapped, dead cold. Here is the cold, hard truth that most frontier homesteaders completely overlooked. Wood is an acceptable windbreak, but as an insulator against sustained sub-zero temperatures, it is fundamentally useless. When thin pine boards freeze, they contract, opening up microscopic gaps between every single batten. The wind pushes cold air through those gaps under high pressure, creating a constant draft that strips away heat through forced convection. A horse standing inside a conventional timber barn in a 40-mile-per-hour wind loses body heat almost as quickly as an animal standing out in an open pasture. So in the spring of 1886, while his neighbors were busy nailing fresh boards onto their drafty barn walls and patching their leaky roofs with tar paper, Emmett Graves did something that made every farmer in the valley stop and stare. He picked up a steel spade, hitched Rust and Cinder to a scoop scraper, and started digging straight into the earth. He was not digging a small root cellar for potatoes. He was not sinking a water well. Emmett excavated a massive rectangular pit, measuring 30 feet long, 18 feet wide, and dug deep into the packed prairie soil, right where he intended to place his main dwelling cabin. Riders passing along the ridge trail slowed their horses to a walk, pulled their hats down against the sun, and stared into the growing pit before shaking their heads and riding away. Nobody asked him what he was doing. In homesteading culture, you did not pry into another man's work unless his project threatened your water rights or crossed your surveyed boundary line. But the silent judgment was everywhere. By late August, the excavation reached a total depth of 8 feet. Emmett shored up the dirt walls using heavy, split cottonwood logs set vertically into trench footings, tamping the blue clay tight behind them. He leveled the hard-packed dirt floor, sloped it gently toward the eastern side, and cut a broad, shallow ramp ascending to the surface. The ramp was built wide enough for a heavy draft horse to walk down without feeling trapped or uneasy. Next, he framed a heavy, load-bearing ceiling across the top of the pit, using thick cottonwood timber beams, spaced just 16 inches apart, covered by cross planks, a thick layer of tamped clay, and dense prairie sod blocks. And right on top of that heavily reinforced underground bunker, Emmett constructed his living cabin. The barn was built directly beneath his bedroom floorboards. When the first severe northern frost dusted the grass in early November, Emmett walked Rust, Cinder, and his 2 saddle horses down the dirt ramp and into the subterranean darkness below his house. He swung a heavy timber plank door closed behind them, dropped a solid oak crossbar into iron brackets, and walked up the exterior wooden steps into his cabin above. He spent his evenings splitting pine kindling, boiling black coffee on his cast-iron wood stove, and reading by the yellow glow of a kerosene lamp. And directly beneath his boots, down in the silence of the earth, his 4 horses stood on bone-dry ground, completely surrounded by 8 feet of dense prairie soil that had been absorbing the summer heat for 4 straight months. Think about that for a second. Emmett Graves had tapped into a fundamental law of physics that modern green building architects are still utilizing today. The Earth is a massive thermal battery. 6 to 8 feet below the surface, soil temperature remains extraordinarily stable 12 months a year. Depending on your exact geographic latitude and soil moisture content, deep ground temperature sits constantly between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not matter if the air above the grass is 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the heat of July or minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the dead of January. The deep earth retains its energy like a heavy iron flywheel, holds rotational momentum. That thermal consistency is known as thermal mass. And Emmett Graves built his entire winter survival strategy around that single scientific reality. His underground horse barn measured roughly 30 feet long by 18 feet wide, with a clear ceiling height of 7 feet. That was just tall enough for a full-size draft horse to stand comfortably without striking its ears, yet low enough to trap every single unit of radiant heat generated by the animals' bodies. The walls were a hybrid construction of packed earth and heavy vertical timber posts, with every seam chinked tightly, using local clay mixed with cured prairie grass fiber. Ventilation was handled with absolute scientific precision. Emmett installed 2 vertical air shafts made of hollowed timber that extended straight up from the underground barn ceiling, passed through the cabin floor above, and vented out through the upper structure. Each shaft measured roughly 4 inches in diameter and was fitted with simple wooden slide valves that Emmett could open or shut with his foot. When the horses were locked inside, he opened the slide valves just enough to allow warm, stale carbon dioxide and moisture to rise out while fresh. Dense outside air trickled in through a tiny intake notch at the main ramp door. It was never enough air movement to create a freezing draft, but just enough to ensure air exchange and prevent moisture condensation from building up on the timber ceiling. The ceiling of the barn, which doubled as the floor of Emmett's living room, was built like an absolute fortress. Heavy cottonwood logs, spaced 16 inches apart, carried smaller wood decking, capped with a 6-inch barrier of compacted blue clay, and covered by a final layer of thick prairie sod. It was completely airtight, structural, and fire-resistant. Critically, this design allowed a tiny fraction of residual heat from Emmett's cabin wood stove to slowly radiate downward into the earth-sheltered barn. It was not a massive amount of heat, just a soft, continuous bleed of thermal energy. But inside an enclosed space, buried beneath 8 feet of dry earth on all 4 sides, even a 5-degree temperature bump made a massive structural difference. Emmett did not need his underground barn to sit at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. He only needed it to stay safely above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And the high thermal mass of the prairie soil, combined with the animal's natural body heat and the faint heat bleeding down from his cabin stove, achieved that goal effortlessly. The design had other brilliant structural advantages that traditional timber barns could never match. Because the barn was fully buried beneath the grade line, it was completely immune to wind shear. On the vast, flat plains of Nebraska, where winter gales easily hit 60 to 70 miles per hour, wind speed was the ultimate destroyer of structures and animals alike. A high-profile wooden barn acted like a massive sail, creating low-pressure zones on its leeward side that literally sucked warm air out through every crack and seam in the wood. Emmett's underground barn had zero wind profile. It did not fight the gale. The gale swept completely over top of it, without ever touching the livestock inside. The only opening to the exterior was the sloped ramp door, which Emmett had deliberately oriented toward the east, facing completely away from the dominant, freezing northwest winter winds. The ramp itself was engineered with great care. It descended at a gentle, 10-degree slope, flanked by retaining walls of stacked prairie sod to prevent soil erosion during rainstorms. If a heavy snowfall hit the homestead, Emmett could clear the sloped ramp with a hand shovel in under 10 minutes. A conventional barn door, by contrast, was routinely pinned shut under 8-foot snowdrifts that took hours of exhausting labor to clear away. And if the absolute worst happened, if a freak monster storm buried the ramp door under a 15-foot drift, Emmett had engineered a built-in emergency backup plan. He had constructed a small, heavy trapdoor right in his cabin floor directly above the horse stalls. In an extreme crisis, he could drop bales of hay and buckets of well water straight down to his stock without ever setting foot outside into the freezing storm. It was a complete closed-loop survival system, engineered not for visual elegance or social status, but for absolute unyielding reliability under extreme environmental stress. Yet, when his homesteading neighbors saw the structure fully finished in the late autumn of 1886, they were unimpressed. A few men openly chuckled. One older farmer, a hard-nosed veteran named Caleb Rohr, who had been farming in the Nebraska Territory since 1873, looked at the earth-covered roof, shook his head, and delivered a harsh warning. "Horses do not live underground, Emmett. You have not built a shelter down there. You have dug yourself a $40 tomb." Emmett simply nodded his head, picked up his split axe, and went right back to stacking his winter firewood. The soft ridicule from the surrounding homesteaders was not loud, and it certainly was not organized. It existed in the small, quiet spaces of frontier life, casual remarks tossed across wagon beds on the dry dirt road, quiet chuckles shared over lukewarm coffee at the general store, and skeptical whispers swapped during Sunday gatherings inside the small wooden schoolhouse that doubled as the community church. Nobody was genuinely angry at Emmett Graves. Nobody believed he was doing anything wicked or defying God. They simply thought he was an odd, stubborn man, wasting months of brutal physical labor on an idea that made zero practical sense. To the average settler who had migrated west from the thick timberlands of Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Indiana, building a homestead followed a strict, unwritten code. You built a wooden cabin for your family, and you built a wooden barn for your stock. You raised timber walls above the sod line, where the sun could hit them, where fresh air could circulate, and where you could see your property standing tall against the horizon. Digging a massive hole in the earth and putting your living room directly on top of your horse stalls felt uncomfortably strange. It ran counter to every tradition they had inherited from their fathers. The comments came easy over the general store counter. Graves put his horses in a hole. That man is living on top of a barn, like some kind of oversized prairie badger. Just wait until the first hard autumn rain hits the valley. That ramp is going to turn into a muddy river, and he is going to drown those poor draft animals in 4 feet of standing slop. Here is what everyone missed about Emmett's methodical process. Emmett Graves had not just dug a pit. He had spent 4 months executing a meticulously planned engineering project, using nothing more than raw muscle, hand tools, and natural materials harvested directly from the prairie landscape. The physical labor alone would have broken a lesser man. Because of the logging accident in Michigan that had crushed his left ankle, Emmett walked with a pronounced, swinging limp. Every time he drove the blade of his heavy steel spade into the hard-packed sandhills clay, his right leg took the entire weight of his body. Day after day, through the blistering heat of June and July, Emmett filled the horse-drawn scoop scraper, hauled hundreds of tons of heavy soil up out of the pit, and piled it in thick, defensive embankments along the north and west perimeters of his site. He did not buy milled pine lumber from the town yard for his subterranean walls. Milled pine was expensive, thin, and prone to rotting when placed in direct contact with damp earth. Instead, Emmett hitched his draft horses and made dozens of long, grueling trips down to the dry creek beds 4 miles south, where wild cottonwood trees grew thick and dense. He felled the trees himself, limbed them with a double-bitted axe, and dragged the heavy green logs back to his homestead claim. To reinforce the dirt walls of the 8-foot-deep pit, Emmett dug narrow trench footings along the perimeter. He split the cottonwood logs in half, setting the flat sides inward toward the interior of the barn and sinking the round, bark-covered sides deep into the trench soil. Between the earth wall and the vertical wood posts, he packed a dense layer of dry gravel and coarse sand that he had shoveled out of a nearby riverbed. That gravel layer acted as a natural French drain, allowing any groundwater that seeped through the upper soil layers to trickle straight down past the wood posts without accumulating hydrostatic pressure against the barn walls. To seal the gaps between the vertical log posts, Emmett mixed a traditional chinking mortar using local blue clay, river sand, and dried prairie grass fiber that he chopped into short strands with his hatchet. He worked the thick clay mixture into every crack with his bare hands, smoothing it flat until the interior walls looked like solid, polished earth. The floor was treated with equal care. He tamped the native clay soil down using a heavy timber block until it was as hard as poured concrete, sloping the entire surface at a subtle 2% grade toward a stone-lined drainage sump he had dug at the foot of the entrance ramp. The construction of the eastern entrance ramp was a masterclass in practical engineering. Emmett knew that if the ramp was too steep, a frightened or tired horse would slip on wet clay and break a leg. He extended the ramp out to a length of 24 feet, creating a broad, gentle slope that dropped just 8 feet over its entire run. Along both sides of the ramp, he built thick retaining walls out of heavy prairie sod blocks, stepped like stairs to hold the sandy hill soil in place. At the bottom of the ramp, where the dirt met the barn entrance, he laid down a thick bed of crushed river gravel topped with 3 inches of oak wood shavings. When a horse stepped off the outdoor ramp and into the barn doorway, its hooves met a soft, dry, high-traction surface that absorbed moisture and prevented slippage. By mid-September, Emmett was ready to construct the heavy overhead ceiling that would double as the floor foundation for his timber cabin. This was the most critical structural element of the entire project. If the ceiling failed, his house would collapse into the pit below, crushing his livestock and destroying his home in a single second. Emmett selected the largest, straightest cottonwood trunks he had harvested, thick logs measuring nearly 14 inches in diameter at the base. He notched the log ends and laid them heavy across the 18-foot span of the pit, spacing them just 16 inches apart from center to center. On top of these primary structural joists, He nailed down a solid layer of 2-inch thick cottonwood cross planks. Over the planking, he laid down a thick sheet of heavy, tar-soaked canvas that he had purchased from a freight wagon driver. Over the canvas went a 4-inch layer of compacted blue clay, followed by a double layer of dense prairie sod blocks laid with their grassy sides facing downward. This multi-layered ceiling sandwich was completely windproof, highly water-resistant, and provided an astonishing level of thermal insulation. On top of this rock-solid, earth-covered platform, Emmett built his modest wood-framed living cabin, complete with a stone fireplace, plank floorboards, and a glass-pane window facing south. In late October, as Emmett was finishing the installation of his cabin stovepipe, a traveling carpenter from Iowa stopped by the homestead to water his team of mules. The carpenter was a tall, lean man named Miller, who claimed to have built barns in 4 different states. He walked around Emmett's low-profile cabin, looked at the earth embankments banked high against the foundation, stepped over to the sloped eastern ramp, and peered down into the subterranean shadow of the underground barn. Miller leaned against the sod-retaining wall, spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt, and let out a long, wheezing laugh. "You do know horses are not moles, right, son?" Emmett was kneeling near his well, drawing a wooden bucket of clear water for the traveler's mules. He did not look up, nor did he pause in his work. He filled the wooden trough and said softly, "Mules can drink." The Iowa carpenter wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve and gestured wildly toward the ramp. "I have built timber barns from the eastern shore of Ohio all the way to the central plains of Kansas. I have framed bank barns, pole barns, and 2-story timber frame hay structures. I have never in my life seen a grown man bury 4 live horses 8 feet under the dirt on purpose. What happens when the autumn rains hit this hole? What happens when you get a flash melt in the spring and 3 feet of water comes rushing down that dirt ramp? You are going to drown your own stock in a mud pit." Emmett handed the man his iron tin cup. "The ramp drains fine," Emmett said in his flat, quiet voice. "The gravel bed takes the runoff, and the clay floor stays bone dry. The horses walk in and out the same as any wooden barn you ever framed." Miller took the water cup, shook his head in utter disbelief, and took a slow drink. "Well, it is your livestock and your back, mister. Just seems to me like a whole lot of back-breaking digging for absolutely nothing. A good white pine barn sitting up on stone piers is what a proper farmer builds. This looks like something a burrowing animal put together." He finished his water, climbed back up onto his wagon seat, snapped his reins across the mules' backs, and drove off down the trail, still shaking his head and chuckling to himself. Emmett watched the wagon disappear over the crest of the sandhills, turned around, picked up his wood axe, and went right back to splitting his oak kindling. Now, think about that for a second. That carpenter's reaction was not unique. It was the consensus of an entire generation of Western builders. They were so accustomed to the visual aesthetics of Eastern timber construction, the tall white cupolas, the towering red-painted pine walls, the massive double barn doors, that they could not evaluate shelter through the pure lens of thermodynamics and thermal efficiency. To them, if a building did not stand tall above the grass, it was not a real building. It was a crude hole in the ground, born out of laziness or poverty. The judgment reached its peak in mid-December, during a cold spell that brought 4 inches of dry, powdery snow to the valley. The local homesteaders gathered at the general store to sit around the glowing cast-iron potbelly stove, trade mail, and discuss the winter outlook. Caleb Rohr was sitting on a wooden cracker barrel near the stove, nursing a cup of black coffee. Caleb was 61 years old, possessed a thick white beard, and was universally regarded as the unofficial elder statesman of the settlement. He had homesteaded through the terrible grasshopper plagues of the 1870s, survived 2 severe droughts, and brought his family through several brutal plains winters. When Caleb spoke, younger farmers listened with absolute reverence. A young settler named Peter Jensen, who had built a small homestead 3 miles west of Emmett's claim, pulled a stool up to the stove and brought up the subject everyone had been whispering about. "Caleb, what do you honestly make of that setup Emmett Graves built over on his claim? He has had his draft horses locked down in that underground pit for 3 weeks now." Caleb Rohr took a slow sip of his hot coffee, stared thoughtfully into the red embers visible through the draft door of the potbelly stove, and cleared his throat. "Emmett is a hard-working man," Caleb said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the quiet store. "He works harder with that bad leg of his than 3 whole men combined. But that underground setup is an absolute catastrophic mistake." The other farmers in the store grew quiet, leaning in to listen. "When you bury livestock underground," Caleb explained, placing his tin cup down on the stove mantel, "you trap animal breath and liquid moisture inside a confined space with zero natural air circulation. Animals breathe out gallons of water vapor every single day. In an above-ground timber barn, that damp air escapes through the cracks in the wallboards. But down in an earth pit, that wet air has nowhere to go. It rises to the ceiling, hits the cold timbers, and condenses into liquid water. Then, when a real blue northern cold front rolls over the prairie and drops the air to 20 below zero, that trapped moisture freezes solid. It turns the walls into sheer ice and fills the room with freezing fog. Damp cold kills livestock 10 times faster than dry wind ever could. Come February, when the real winter hits us, Emmett is going to be using that shovel of his to dig 4 frozen, stiff horses out of that mud hole." A murmur of strong agreement passed through the store. Several older farmers nodded their heads in grim unison. Caleb's explanation sounded completely logical. It was rooted in what seemed like common sense and years of practical frontier experience. Moisture traps cold. Ice kills animals. Therefore, burying horses in a dirt pit was a guaranteed death sentence. The consensus was officially sealed. Emmett Graves was not dangerous, but he was hopelessly misguided. He had built a structural death trap out of pure stubbornness. Yet, while the community held its breath waiting for Emmett's grand failure, Emmett was quietly proving the theory of underground shelter every single day. Inside his subterranean barn, the atmospheric conditions were entirely different from what Caleb Rohr had predicted. Because Emmett had installed those 2 adjustable 4-inch wooden ventilation shafts through the cabin floor, damp air did not get trapped inside the pit. The natural buoyant property of warm, moist air created a continuous, gentle stack effect. The warm breath from the 4 horses naturally drifted upward toward the ceiling, where it was drawn straight into the twin timber vents and exhausted through the roof of Emmett's cabin into the outside air. By adjusting the simple slide valves with his wooden boot heel, Emmett could fine-tune the exhaust rate with remarkable precision. If he felt the air inside the barn getting slightly humid or heavy with the smell of ammonia, he kicked the slide valves open another inch. The fresh, cold, high-density outside air trickled down the broad eastern entrance ramp, sweeping gently across the gravel floor, picking up the stale air, and carrying it up and out through the ceiling vents. It was a completely natural passive ventilation system that required 0 mechanical fans, 0 electricity, and 0 complex machinery. It relied entirely on the fundamental laws of fluid dynamics and thermal buoyancy. Inside the pit, the earth walls remained bone dry. The 8 feet of dense prairie soil surrounding the structure acted as a massive thermal buffer, completely dampening the daily temperature swings happening on the surface above. While the outside air temperature fluctuated wildly, dropping from 35 degrees Fahrenheit at noon to 5 degrees below zero at midnight, the internal temperature of the underground barn remained rock solid at 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The 4 horses were thriving. Their thick winter coats were clean, glossy, and free of the mud and ice crusts that plagued animals kept in drafty timber shelters. When Emmett walked down the ramp each morning at 6 o'clock to pitch fresh wild meadow hay into their wooden mangers, Rust and Cinder would turn their heavy heads, soft nicker in greeting, and stretch their necks comfortably. There was 0 shivering. There was no icy frost coating their manes or eyelashes. The water standing in their heavy oak trough was completely liquid, clear, and free of even the thinnest skim of ice. While neighboring farmers spent 40 minutes every morning using iron crowbars to break 3 inches of solid ice out of their open wooden stock tanks, Emmett simply dipped a cedar bucket into liquid water and filled his horses' grain buckets. Emmett had also stocked his underground bunker with meticulous foresight. Along the back northern wall of the pit, completely sheltered from the elements, he had neatly stacked 3 cords of dry, split hardwood logs and 2 tons of sweet, late-cut prairie hay. He did not have to trudge through deep snowdrifts to feed his stock or collect fuel for his home. Everything he needed to survive a prolonged winter siege was contained within a single, unified, earth-sheltered structure. By the first week of January 1887, the weather across the Nebraska sandhills turned deceptively calm. The air was still, cold, and bright, with a pale winter sun hanging low in the southern sky. Settlers went about their chores, convinced that the worst of the winter had already passed. They patched their fences, hauled water, and congratulated themselves on surviving another Plains December. They had no idea that thousands of miles to the north, over the barren wilderness of Western Canada, an extraordinary atmospheric event was taking shape. A massive, high-pressure polar air mass of unprecedented size and density was moving rapidly south, pushing a wall of Arctic air toward the American border. It was a storm that would defy every weather pattern in recorded frontier history. A catastrophic white maelstrom that would test every structure, every animal, and every human being living on the Great Plains. And while his neighbors relaxed in their drafty wooden cabins, Emmett Graves stepped out onto his sod roof, pulled his heavy wool coat tight around his chest, looked up at the pale northern horizon, and felt the barometric pressure begin to plummet. Before we step into the terrifying heart of the storm that broke over the Nebraska plains on the morning of January 12, 1887, we have to pause and decode the exact physical science behind what Emmett Graves had constructed. Because what happened beneath that sod cabin was not luck, magic, or divine intervention. It was pure, undeniable thermodynamics. To understand why Emmett's horses survived, while thousands of animals in conventional wooden barns died standing up, you have to look at the massive physical contrast between thermal conductivity and thermal mass. In a standard wooden barn built above the surface, the primary insulating medium is wood and trapped air. Pine lumber has a thermal conductivity rating that allows heat to escape rapidly when exposed to a sharp temperature gradient. Furthermore, air itself has almost zero thermal mass. Air cannot store heat energy for any meaningful length of time. The moment a cold gale blows across a wooden wall, the warm air inside the structure is stripped away through forced convective cooling. If the air outside a wooden barn drops from 20 degrees above zero to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, the air inside that barn will follow suit in a matter of 2 or 3 hours. The timber walls act like a thermal highway, pulling heat out of the barn and radiating it into the frozen night sky. Now, picture what happens when you move that entire structure 8 feet below the natural grade line of the prairie. Soil operates under completely different physical laws. Dry soil and clay possess an extraordinarily high thermal mass and very low thermal conductivity. Soil absorbs thermal energy at a glacial pace, but more importantly, it releases that stored energy at an equally slow pace. This physical phenomenon is known in modern building science as thermal lag or ground phase shift. At a depth of 6 to 8 feet beneath the surface of the Nebraska sandhills, the surrounding soil mass does not respond to daily atmospheric weather fluctuations. In fact, deep ground temperature lags behind surface atmospheric temperature by roughly 3 to 4 months. The soil surrounding Emmett's underground barn in January was still radiating the accumulated solar warmth it had absorbed during the hot, sunny months of August and September. The numbers don't lie. While the surface temperature on the open prairie dropped to a lethal 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit during the peak of the blizzard, the soil mass surrounding Emmett's dugout remained locked at a stable 48 degrees Fahrenheit. That created a massive 88-degree thermal differential between the freezing world above the grass and the protected bunker beneath the floorboards. To achieve that same 88-degree temperature lift in an above-ground timber barn, a homesteader would have been forced to burn roughly 2 full cords of dense hardwood firewood every single week in a massive iron furnace. Emmett Graves achieved it using 0 fuel, 0 moving parts, and 0 mechanical energy. He simply let the physics of the earth hold the line. Here's what everyone missed about Emmett's design. Emmett had not actually invented this concept. He had simply looked past the cultural biases of his era and rediscovered a survival technology that indigenous peoples across the Great Plains had perfected over hundreds of years. For centuries before European settlers arrived with their saws and pine boards, native nations like the Pawnee, the Mandan, and the Hidatsa built earth-sheltered lodges along the river valleys of Nebraska, Dakota, and Missouri. The Pawnee built massive circular earth lodges dug several feet into the ground, with thick timber frameworks covered by layers of willow brush, packed thatch, and sod blocks up to 2 feet thick. In the dead of a northern Great Plains winter, a single Pawnee earth lodge holding 20 or 30 family members could maintain a comfortable interior temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit with nothing more than a tiny, smoldering central fire. The surrounding earth walls completely neutralized the screaming prairie winds, eliminated draft infiltration, and trapped the radiant heat of the human bodies inside. European settlers, moving west from the timber-rich regions of the American East, largely dismissed these indigenous structural masterpieces as crude or primitive. They brought their rigid traditions of balloon frame carpentry, vertical timber barn walls, and elevated wooden floors, stubbornly forcing Eastern architectural concepts onto an unforgiving Western landscape that demanded completely different engineering. They paid for that cultural arrogance with thousands of dead cattle, collapsed roofs, and frozen homesteads every single winter. Emmett Graves, operating with a quiet pragmatism forged in the brutal logging camps of Michigan, did not care about architectural tradition or social status. He saw that timber failed, he saw that the earth endured, and he acted accordingly. Beyond the massive thermal storage of the soil, Emmett's underground barn solved a second critical engineering problem that killed thousands of animals in conventional shelters: wind pressure dynamics. When a 60-mile-per-hour wind hits a rectangular wooden barn standing 12 feet high on an open plain, it creates an intense aerodynamic dynamic. The wind striking the windward wall creates a high-pressure zone, forcing cold air through every microscopic seam in the wood. Simultaneously, as the wind sweeps over the apex of the barn roof and around the side walls, it creates a powerful low-pressure suction zone on the leeward side. This pressure imbalance actively pulls warm air out of the building through every crack in the rear wall. The wooden barn literally acts as a mechanical pump, continuously exchanging its warm interior air for freezing outside air. Because Emmett's horse shelter was completely subterranean, its wind profile was exactly zero. The howling prairie winds swept completely over the top of the dugout structure without ever striking a vertical wall or creating a pressure imbalance. The ground-level sod roof of the barn, which doubled as the floor of Emmett's cabin, simply allowed the Arctic gale to slide harmlessly over top. The only exposed surface was the gentle, sloped eastern entrance ramp, which Emmett had purposefully oriented away from the prevailing northwest winds and protected with stacked sod retaining walls. Then, there was the genius of moisture control. As Caleb Rohr had correctly observed at the general store, livestock emit massive amounts of moisture through respiration and waste. A full-sized draft horse breathes out nearly 2 gallons of liquid water in the form of warm vapor every 24 hours. In an unventilated, cold enclosed space, that water vapor accumulates rapidly, raising the relative humidity to 100%. When damp air hits a cold surface, it condenses into liquid water droplets, or freezes into heavy rime ice, soaking the animal's fur coats and destroying their natural insulation value. A wet horse, in a freezing draft, will develop severe pneumonia and die within 48 hours. Emmett solved this through passive convective stack ventilation. By installing those 2 hollow 4-inch timber shafts extending from the barn ceiling up through his cabin floorboards, he created a natural heat chimney. Warm, moist air is naturally less dense than cold, dry air. As the horses breathed, their warm, humid breath rose naturally toward the ceiling of the dugout. Instead of condensing on the timber beams, the warm vapor drifted directly into the lower openings of the timber vents. As the warm air rose up through the 4-inch flues, it created a gentle, continuous, low-pressure draw at the floor level of the barn. This draw pulled small amounts of fresh, dense air down the sloped entrance ramp to replace the exhausted air. Emmett could adjust the wooden slide valves at the top of the vents to control the exact rate of air exchange. On an unusually mild night, he slid the valves wide open. On a night when the temperature plummeted toward 30 below zero, he closed the valves down to a narrow quarter-inch slit. This kept the ventilation rate just high enough to remove excess respiratory moisture without dumping the precious heat energy stored in the surrounding earth walls. The result was an interior environment that remained at a stable 48 degrees Fahrenheit with a relative humidity hovering around 45%, bone-dry, warm, still, and completely comfortable for 4 heavy draft horses. On the morning of January 12, 1887, that brilliant engineering system faced its ultimate test. The day began with an eerie, unnatural calm across the Nebraska sandhills. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the air was surprisingly mild, hovering near 20 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit. Children walked to school without wearing their heavy wool coats, and farmers stepped out into their yards in their shirt sleeves to stretch their legs and haul morning water. But by 9 o'clock, the sky to the northwest underwent a terrifying transformation. The pale blue horizon turned the color of bruised iron, fading rapidly into a deep, sickly blackish purple. The wind, which had been blowing gently from the south, suddenly died completely. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the plains. A silence so intense, you could hear the faint rustle of dry corn stalks half a mile away. Emmett Graves was standing near his well, greasing the iron pulley wheel, when he noticed the sudden drop in barometric pressure. The air felt thick, heavy, and metallic. He turned his head toward the northwest and saw the horizon disappear behind a wall of white fog moving across the hills at terrifying speed. It was not a gradual snowfall. It was the frontal edge of a massive Arctic squall line, a blizzard so fierce and sudden that history would forever remember it as the Children's Blizzard of 1887. Emmett did not hesitate for a single second. He dropped his grease rag, ran to the small outdoor pen, and unlatched the gate where Rust, Cinder, and his 2 saddle horses were grazing. He did not need to lead them with ropes. The animals felt the atmospheric shift, smelled the impending ice in the air, and moved with urgent haste. Emmett guided them down the broad, sloped eastern ramp and pushed them through the heavy timber door into the warmth of the subterranean barn. He poured a fresh bucket of well water into their trough, dumped 2 large armfuls of cured meadow hay into their wooden mangers, and checked the timber ceiling beams. Everything was solid and dry. Emmett stepped back out onto the ramp, pulled the heavy oak door shut, dropped the 2-inch thick crossbar into its forged iron brackets, and stuffed a rolled wool blanket into the small seam at the top of the frame. He climbed the outdoor steps to his cabin, stepped inside, slammed his heavy pine door, and threw the iron latch into place. Less than 3 minutes later, the storm struck the homestead with the force of an exploding shell. The wind hit the sandhills with a deafening, metallic roar, accelerating from 0 to 70 miles per hour in under 60 seconds. The air temperature did not drop gradually. It plunged 35 degrees in less than 3 hours, eventually bottoming out at a lethal 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The snow that accompanied the gale was not composed of soft, delicate flakes. It was a dense, blinding storm of microscopic ice pellets, hard, sharp crystals crushed to fine dust by 90-mile-per-hour upper atmospheric winds. The ice dust was so fine that it penetrated the tightest grain in solid pine wood, filling every home in the valley with a fine white haze. Visibility dropped to absolute 0 in less than 5 minutes. A man standing on his own front porch could not see his hand held 2 inches from his face. The world outside became a screaming, white maelstrom, where sound was distorted and all sense of directional orientation vanished instantly. Settlers who were caught in their open yards, 50 feet from their front doors, lost their way, walked in circles through the blinding whiteout, and froze to death within sight of their own glowing windows. Homesteaders tied long hemp ropes between their cabins and their timber barns just so they could feel their way back and forth to feed their stock. Some had the ropes snapped out of their frozen fingers by 90-mile-per-hour gusts, stumbled off into the drifts, and were found weeks later frozen solid against fence posts miles away. Inside conventional wooden barns across 3 Nebraska counties, absolute terror reigned. At Peter Jensen's homestead, 3 miles west of Emmett's claim, the howling northwest gale struck his newly built pine barn broadside. The thin pine board walls groaned, flexed, and began to buckle under the immense wind load. Cold air rushed through every knothole and seam, lowering the internal temperature of the barn to 20 degrees below zero in under 40 minutes. Peter's 5 head of milk cows stood huddled together in their stalls, their breath freezing instantly into thick sheets of clear ice across their muzzles. Within 2 hours, the cows stopped shivering, their muscle tissues began to freeze, and their core body temperatures collapsed. Peter tried to reach the barn to pile extra straw around his stock, but the wind blew him off his feet, ripping his wool coat open and freezing his right hand before he managed to crawl back to his cabin door. Over at Caleb Rohr's farmstead, the situation was equally dire. Caleb's traditional elevated timber barn, which he had framed with heavy oak posts and pine siding, became a freezing wind tunnel. The gale lifted several wood shingles off the roof, allowing fine ice dust to pour into the loft by the barrel. The ice dust packed tight around his horse's legs, freezing their bedding into solid rock. Caleb's 2 prize draft mares, shivering violently in the sub-zero draft, burned through their internal energy reserves in less than 12 hours. By the second night of the storm, one of the mares collapsed onto the frozen dirt floor, unable to rise. And over at the Pritchard homestead, disaster was total. Their temporary lean-to barn, built out of pine planks and thatch, collapsed entirely under the weight of a 12-foot snowdrift, crushing 3 draft horses and smothering 4 calves beneath a mountain of frozen snow. While the storm destroyed farms and killed livestock across hundreds of miles of open prairie, Emmett Graves sat quietly inside his earth-sheltered cabin. His cast-iron stove glowed a dull red, burning small pieces of dry cottonwood. Every few hours, Emmett leaned down, picked up a small wooden block, and slid open the trapdoor cut into his cabin floorboards. He peered down into the warm, dark silence of the dugout barn below. Down in the subterranean shelter, there was no wind. There was no screaming gale, no blinding ice pellets, and no plummeting temperature. The air was still, soft, and smelled faintly of dry hay and sweet pine shavings. Rust and Cinder were standing comfortably in their stalls, slowly chewing their meadow hay. Their coats were completely dry. The temperature inside the underground barn held steady at 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The water in their wooden trough remained fully liquid, clear, and warm to the touch. Emmett dropped 2 extra flakes of hay straight down through the floor trapdoor, watched his horses reach out their muzzles to eat, closed the trapdoor tight, and walked back over to his stove to pour himself another cup of hot coffee. For 72 straight hours, the blizzard raged across the sand hills, burying the world under mountains of white ice. And for 72 straight hours, the deep earth held the 4 horses safely in its 48-degree embrace, completely oblivious to the deadly fury roaring just 8 feet above their heads. On the morning of the 4th day, the screaming wind finally died. The silence that fell across the Nebraska sandhills was thick, heavy, and eerie. Emmett Graves unlatched his cabin door and stepped out into a world completely reshaped by ice. Massive snowdrifts 20 feet high leaned heavy against the north side of his homestead cabin. The sun came out in a cloudless, pale blue sky, glittering across the endless white waste with a blinding glare that hurt the eyes. Emmett grabbed his broad steel shovel and walked around to the eastern entrance ramp. His sod-retaining walls had done their job with absolute perfection. While the surrounding yard was buried under 5 feet of hard-packed snow, the sloped ramp had accumulated only 3 feet of drifted powder. Emmett worked methodically, digging a clear path down to the heavy oak door. It took him under 2 hours of steady shoveling. He unlatched the heavy iron bar, swung the oak timber door wide, and stepped into the warm darkness of the underground barn. The air inside felt soft, clean, and completely still. All 4 horses were standing calmly in their stalls, turning their heavy heads to greet him with soft nickers. Their coats were thick, dry, and glossy. There was 0 ice on their manes, eyelashes, or hooves. Emmett led Rust, Cinder, and his 2 saddle horses up the dirt ramp and out into the bright morning sunlight. The horses blinked in the intense white glare, shook their heavy heads, and snorted clouds of steam into the crisp air, stepping onto the packed snow with clear, unbothered energy. Later that afternoon, Caleb Rohr came riding over the crest of the sandhills on a half-starved bay mare. Caleb looked battered and exhausted. He had spent 3 agonizing days trying to keep his remaining stock alive inside his drafty timber barn, losing 2 prime horses and a milk cow to exposure. He was riding from homestead to homestead across the valley, checking on survivors, assessing the damage, and searching for live animals that could be bought or traded. When Caleb reached the top of the ridge overlooking Emmett's claim, he fully expected to see a scene of total ruin. He expected to find Emmett digging frozen horse carcasses out of a flooded mud pit. Instead, what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. Standing in Emmett's front yard, peacefully pawing through 3 inches of cleared snow to reach dry grass beneath, were Emmett's 4 horses. Their coats were full, thick, and shiny. Their ribs were hidden under healthy layers of fat. They were not shivering. They showed 0 signs of frostbite or cold stress. They looked as if they had spent the last 3 days inside a heated stable in Omaha. Caleb dismounted slowly, his heavy boots sinking into the white drifts. He walked across the yard without saying a word. Emmett was standing near the well, clearing snow away from the wooden bucket crank. He looked up, nodded his head calmly, and said, "Caleb." Caleb stood staring at the 4 horses for nearly a minute before his flat voice broke the silence. "Are those the exact same 4 horses you had before the storm hit?" Emmett nodded. "They are. Where did you keep them for 72 hours? Emmett pointed his spade down toward the earth beneath his cabin floorboards. "Same place I have been keeping them since November. Down in the hole." Caleb walked over to the eastern ramp, descended the shovel-cleared dirt path, and stepped inside the underground barn. He stood in the center of the gravel floor, looking at the dry cottonwood timber ceiling, touching the packed clay walls, and breathing in the still, dry air. There was no frost on the ceiling beams, no ice on the floor, and no smell of damp rot. Caleb pulled a small brass thermometer out of his coat pocket, suspended it from a timber post, and watched the red mercury column settle. The numbers don't lie. Outside on the open prairie, the thermometer read 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Inside the subterranean barn, the red mercury rose steadily and stopped at precisely 48 degrees Fahrenheit. That was a temperature difference of 63 degrees, between the freezing world above the sod and the bunker below. Caleb Rohr stood in that underground barn for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the timber ventilation flues, looked at the dry gravel floor, and then walked back up the dirt ramp into the sunlight. He walked right up to Emmett, looked him square in the eye, and took off his heavy wool hat. "I called this setup a tomb, Emmett," Caleb said, his voice gravelly and completely devoid of pride. "I stood in the general store and told every farmer in this valley that you were trapping moisture and going to freeze your stock to death. I was completely, utterly wrong. You did not build a tomb. You built the only structure in this entire county that actually worked when winter came to kill us." Emmett did not gloat. He did not smile, chuckle, or say, "I told you so." He simply nodded his head, placed his hand on Cinder's neck, and said, "Ground does not freeze 8 feet down, Caleb. You just have to let the earth do what the earth naturally wants to do." Caleb did not leave for another 2 hours. He pulled a small leather notebook from his pocket and asked Emmett every technical question imaginable. How deep did you dig? What was the exact pitch of the entrance ramp? How many inches wide are those ceiling flues? How did you layer the sod ceiling over the canvas? Emmett answered every single question patiently, factually, and thoroughly, like a master craftsman explaining how to set an axe blade. When Caleb finally mounted his horse and rode back down the trail, he was carrying something far more valuable than livestock. He was carrying an irrefutable engineering truth. Word spread across the Nebraska sandhills like wildfire. Over the next 3 weeks, dozens of homesteaders rode out to Emmett's claim to walk down the dirt ramp and feel the dry 48-degree air for themselves. The transformation was immediate. In the spring of 1887, a homesteader named William Tapper, living 6 miles northeast of Emmett, excavated a 30-foot dugout barn into a natural hillside, topping it with a timber living cabin. During the severe cold snap of December 1887, Tapper's livestock survived without losing a single pound of weight. By 1888, a rancher along the Niobrara River built a half-dugout barn featuring a south-facing stone wall that captured solar radiation during the day and stored it in the earth floor overnight. Near the Dismal River, another family constructed a dual-purpose underground structure, half-root cellar, half-livestock shelter, and reported that their workhorses remained healthier through the winter than they ever had in a traditional pine barn. County Land Survey records from 1889 show that within a 40-mile radius of Emmett's original homestead, at least 23 dugout or semi-subterranean barns had been constructed. None of these buildings were recommended by government agricultural agents. None of them came from college research manuals. They spread through pure vernacular survival engineering, one neighbor watching another survive, learning the physics, and copying what worked. In the spring of 1890, Caleb Rohr, the man who had called Emmett's barn a tomb, built his own massive subterranean horse barn. He dug it 9 feet deep, reinforced the walls with stone footings, and added a second entrance ramp for easy manure clearing. He never offered a formal, verbal apology to Emmett, because the physical act of building his own earth-sheltered barn was the ultimate apology. Here is the fundamental truth that Emmett Graves understood back in 1886 that modern off-grid builders are rediscovering today. You do not fight the landscape, you cooperate with it. The Great Plains are unforgiving. The winter wind does not negotiate with human ego. The extreme cold does not care how much money you spent on milled lumber, how straight your wall framing is, or how handsome your red-painted barn looks from the county road. You can build the tallest pine structure on the prairie, and winter will still find a way to bleed the heat out of it until everything inside is frozen solid. Or you can dig down. You can let 8 feet of dense, unyielding earth stand between your animals and a 60-mile-per-hour Arctic gale. You can let the natural thermal mass of the soil act as a perpetual heat battery, holding the line when the atmospheric temperature collapses to 40 below zero. It is not magic. It is pure, timeless physics. Emmett Graves passed away in 1903, 17 years after he dug that pit beneath his cabin. His original underground barn remained in continuous daily use for over 50 years, shelter for stock through the 1910s, the 1920s, and into the late 1930s, until rural electrification and cheap mechanical heating changed the way Americans built homesteads. Today, modern sustainable architects call this passive annual heat storage. Engineers design earth-bermed homes, subterranean greenhouses, and passive solar structures, using the exact same thermodynamic principles that Emmett Graves applied with a spade and a scoop scraper in 1886. The technology has evolved, but the underlying laws of physics remain completely unchanged. So here is my question for you today. If you were building an off-grid shelter or homestead property right now, which part of Emmett's subterranean strategy would you apply to your own land? Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and how you handle extreme winter freezing on your property. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current building codes, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.